Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Western Heritage Center for a very special program. Before I get into introducing our speaker today, I did want to mention our high noon lecture in November, November 21. Sounds like it's going to be an amazing program. Oh, by the way, my name is Kevin Koister. I'm the director of the museum. November 21, Kevin Koister will be presenting on Chandler Cohen, Montana Architecture Designs for Living. So we've been working on a walking tour brochure for the historic district and have identified about 26 properties that were designed by the architect Chandler Cohen, kind of north of Pioneer Park, north of McKinley School area. So I'll be talking about that in a month. What else did I need to announce? Anybody? Am I missing something right now? Walking tours are done. Had a great year. Playapalooza is in early December, let's say December 7th, Saturday, from 10 to 2. That's an annual event we have where we have activities and games for kids, historic games, things they've never seen before, like pickup sticks and stuff like that. So, anyway, today we have a friend of mine, comes from us from Missoula, brought Nancy. They're on the road right now traveling. I met Lee about 25 years ago when I started working here, and actually he's obsessed, I think he's okay with that term, with building quality exhibits about the history of the American West. So this is the first time I've been here in 25 years. We actually have two of his shows up simultaneously. So he shoots 8x10 glass plate negatives, and that's the Homestead exhibit you see here. And then we have the Frederic Remington drawings from the Harper's Weekly and such that he's going to talk about today. So Lee Silliman is an exhibit designer, teacher, writer, and photographer who specializes in large format imagery. He is the former photo archivist of the Powell County Museum and Arts Foundation in Deer Lodge, Montana, where he was also a chemistry teacher and a physics teacher, which I always find fascinating that people from the science disciplines end up building traveling exhibits, that sense of order in the world. So I know lives in Missoula. His one-man photo exhibition, and I said we have two of them here, include Frederic Remington, Old West Illustrator, Homestead Fever, also here, The Art of the Bird, a historical perspective on avian art, which we had about 2 years ago, which was well received, and Dancing Waters, the Lake Streams and Waterfalls of Yellowstone. In the past 4 decades, Lee has been photographing natural features in America's wild spaces. I know he loves Utah, as I do also, and also backcountry Yellowstone. He takes his 8x10-inch camera out into the backcountry, and I think you have an assistant now, right, who lugs a lot of the equipment, helps him out. So, and many of his Yellowstone backcountry images, over 300 now, reside in the permanent collection for Yellowstone National Park Archives. So, and Lee will be available for questions after the program. So if you have questions about the Homestead exhibit or the Remington illustrations, he'll be here. So without further ado, Lee Silliman.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for that warm introduction. I feel at home here. I've had a lot of shows here. Kevin and I have been friends for a long time. I throw so many ideas at him. He's got a folder that is bulging. And I just threw 2 more at him here a few minutes ago. So you may see more of me someday, potentially. And I'm very pleased that I have, for the first time, 2 shows concurrent at a museum. So this is really a special time for me. And so thank you for that very warm introduction. I'll give you a brief background about this show before I start into it. These are original woodblock engravings from the 1880s and early 1890s. I do not deal in modern reproductions. So everything that you see in the side room over here, they're original woodcut illustrations from Harper's Weekly. And there are other copies out there, but I think I have a really fine collection all in one set of frames going next to the Rockpile Museum, and then it's going to go to the Powell County Museum in Deer Lodge, where it'll reside permanently. You might say this is the first half of Remington's career. He was an illustrator. As so many artists, when they're young and starting in the medium, they need to earn money to put food and shelter, for them and their family. And so they have to do artwork for other people. And that's what these woodblock engravings were in his first half of his career. But as they get more talented, they develop fine art. It is art that they do for themselves. And I'm pleased to say that I'm actually gathering now an impressive collection. It's already matted and framed, and I'm writing the introductions. It's going to be Remington in color. He had a special contract with Collier's magazine, who reproduced in color, halftone, medium, his important paintings. And in fact, some of the pictures in that show are the only surviving images, because he burned some of his canvases because he got stung by some of the artistic criticism of the day. So this is the first half of his career. So let's get on our horse and move down the trail. So what are we going to cover today? And I say interwoven themes, even though I'm going to break them down, they all kind of blend together, and they're not discretely different. We're going to talk about his early childhood, which was rough, and then his early Harper's Weekly assignments in the Southwest, and then going on to his relationship with African Americans and his love of the horse. And then we're going to look at the medium that these pictures were created in. They're a subtopic that I think is of interest. And we're going to also discuss his relationship with Native Americans. And he loved Mexico. We're going to throw a few items at you that show his love of the color, the form and color of Mexican culture. And also discuss how he ingratiated himself with the United States Army. He considered himself the premier artist of the American soldier in the West. And we're going to look at how he used photography to augment his art. And we're going to finish up with his transition to a fine art painter. So, his early childhood. His father was a general in the Civil War who he admired greatly, and he was the only child, and they tried their best to raise him as a nice, orderly young man, but he had a wild nature to himself. He refused to be tamed as a young child. He was a lot of trouble to them. Have you ever heard of that, anybody? A child that wasn't perfect? Well, they thought, well, let's send him to a military institution. Maybe they can teach him some discipline. He didn't last very long at a military institution. And before long, I think in his late teens, he actually then took off to the West because, the frontier was, quote, closing in the late 1880s and 90s. The last of the wars against Native Americans were coming to a close then. And so he went out west, and he came, and he loved to draw. He had been doing that since his early childhood days. So he came back from some trips to the West and showed them to Harper's Weekly. And his drawings were the basis of finished works that were worked on by other artists. So for example, this is the first picture that we can credit to Frederic Remington that was published in Harper's Weekly, but it had to be drawn by a more skillful artist named W.A. Rogers. And as we're going to see, this continued for a little while. They used his sketches as the basis for pictures to tell stories, but they had other artists do the refined finished product that were turned into woodblock engravings that were published. So as you can see here, this was redone by a Harper's artist named Thulstrup. By the way, this title comes from the Oklahoma land rush when the land was taken from Native people in Oklahoma. Whites were trying to sneak in to stake their claim or know where they would stake their claim, and the army was there to escort them back across the line so that everybody had a chance on the opening day to go. And so those early ones that crossed the line were called boomers. That was how he got the title. Here's just another illustration derived from Remington's sketchbook that was again redrawn by another artist. But he hung in there. He kept submitting his artwork to them, and knew that someday, he would be the principal artist. And here's one more picture, again, that was redrawn. And I'd like to poke some criticism at this artist who was taking Remington's pictures and trying to make something out of them. Would you agree that we have a nice hole in the middle of the picture? I don't think you'll ever find a Remington picture that he signed his name to that would leave such a gap in the middle of the picture. Artistically, I think that's really weird. You hardly know where to look. I think artists, if you look at from the artistic composition point of view, that's a pretty lousy picture. So I blame Mr. Thulstrup for that, not Remington. Well, here is the first picture that Remington was given full credit for, and it was part of the campaign in the Southwest to chase down Geronimo. He was with the Army during part of that. Not in any skirmishes or battles, but he got a taste of what the Army was doing in the Southwest deserts in the late 1860s. And so that's kind of a significant picture. I haven't memorized all the pictures you have in there. Kevin can't hang the whole show. The whole show is about twice that size. But you'll have to forgive me if not every picture you're going to see is hanging there. But anyway. Here is another picture that I'll poke fun at and criticize. I think there's somewhat of a lack of coherence here. Where do you look? There's like a whole line of interest here. And he fairly quickly was able to begin to refine his composition, learning from other talented artists of the time period. This is okay, and we kind of focus in on these, but he's just got too much going there. And as we're going to see, he refined his artistic techniques. By the way, in his early days that we're talking about in this time period, in the 1880s, he actually made his paintings in black and white with gouache. And so this is the painting that was turned over to the engravings. Now in the art world, sometimes the artist actually carves the picture onto the woodblock, which is then printed the multiple copies. But the longer the woodblock tradition continued into the late 1800s, the more often it was the case that the artist created a painting like this one, and then they would turn it over to an engraver who would then make the picture. So we'll go back. There is the engraving, and here is the actual painting that Remington did. And we're going to see some more examples of that. I'd like to give this as an illustration of some of the high quality art that was being created by other artists at the time. Perhaps you have heard of Henry Farney, who was an excellent artist. And I think you can see that this is a very strong composition. You know exactly where to look, and everything else is subservient to it. There's not a shred of doubt as to the message being conveyed by the artist for this picture. Here is a poor soldier who perhaps doesn't have too long to live, but he's going to suffer before he dies at the hand of the native person there. Here is, I think, an excellent early picture showing the strong composition that Remington was beginning to develop. You look right here. You know that this is a contest of wills between man and beast. His composition is really starting to be refined. Notice even in the background how things are fading out. You do have other elements in the background, but they're more subdued. So he's learning to emphasize what he wants the viewer to look at, and making more minimal the supplementary and auxiliary materials that help create the whole show, but don't want to compete with the main actors. There is the painting that was used as the template then for this engraving that was published in the magazine. But that painting is now at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. Before too long, he was going to leave black and white behind, but not quite yet. So here's another example from his time in the Southwest, and you know to look at these men here suffering from the sandstorm. And I want you to notice something as we go through. You remember one of my subtopics was the horse. Most of the paintings and illustrations, not all of them, but I would say easily the vast majority, had a horse in them. So keep that in mind as we look at a lot of these. And again, here is the big oil painting that he did in black and white, because that was the medium that the engravers needed to have. They needed to know what shade from pure black to pure white and what gray in between was to be used. And the wood block engravers got very skilled at conveying texture from pure black to pure white and all shades of gray in between. And these black and white oil paintings were very useful. All right, let's look at Remington a little more carefully going into the Southwest. He pictured himself in this painting following this Army command. Now, he would like the public to believe that he was like embedded with the Army, and in a sense he was. He was out there with them, but he never was there during any of the serious, hard-bitten campaigns where they really went off into on a long period of time in rough country where they were fighting the Native Americans. He actually had to quit some of his expeditions with them because it just got too dangerous and too stressed, and they didn't want him along, and he was glad not to. So here is one of his fine engravings that derived from one of his Southwest expeditions with the Army. And I just love the artistry. You focus in on the leader, Geronimo, and you can see what's going on. So his composition is slowly but effectively improving as he gets further along in his career. All right, let's look at his relationship to African Americans. He had a positive attitude toward them. And here's are some quotes. He wrote a lot of journals. He sent a lot of letters. And he actually published a large number of articles, not only in Harper's, but in other magazines. There are two Remington experts, Harold and Peggy Samuels, who have compiled all of the articles that he's ever written, and they're in a pretty thick book, about 3 inches thick, like 300 or 400 pages long. So he wrote a lot, not only for publication, but in letters. And here are some quotes. He says, "I'm greatly gratified to be able to say that I like the Negro soldier's character as a soldier in almost every particular." He called them good style men. He was very impressed with their willingness to endure the hardships. This was the attempt by Native Americans to prove that they could stand beside white men and be a African American. Yeah, I'm sorry. That the African American soldier could stand with the white man and take and withstand the fighting rigors of the Southwest. So he had a lot of respect for them. On the other hand, well, here's a picture he shows of an African soldier being rescued. So he wasn't afraid to depict them in his pictures. And this was fairly rare at that time period, to show African Americans making sacrifices. That was not very commonly illustrated in the popular press at the time. So he had a lot of respect for them. On the other hand, he used some of the derogatory language that we don't repeat anymore. Some of his letters are filled with the N-word. So he was part of the milieu that had opinions about him, and he used some of those stereotypical words and phrases, but deep down he had a lot of respect for their abilities that he could see on display in the Southwest. He was also became very friendly with some of the people in the Army, in particular this Powhatan Clark. He made him fairly noted by putting him on a front page picture. He unfortunately died in an accident and cut his career. He was a very fine soldier. Here are some of the examples again of the Buffalo Soldiers. He used some of the language that we don't repeat anymore, but he still had respect for them. Look, I mean, here he is using the N-word and saying they're some of the best soldiers in the world. So it's you have to understand its time frame. Men with the bark on them. You know, until this time, the fine art in America was not accustomed to seeing paintings or pictures of these rough characters. I mean, look at these types. If you saw one of those on the street today, you might want to walk on the other side of the street. But his ability to work these imageries into his fine paintings and illustrations made people understand that these rough characters could have some real value to the artistry that he was creating. So here is a picture that I like showing again the horse of the Western Plains. You know, in eastern United States, they were accustomed to the thoroughbreds and the refined horses of the genteel America, so to speak. And out in the West, the horses were much more tough, not as, quote, beautiful. They weren't, genetically selected. They were there. A lot of the horses that were used in the West were captured from wild horse herds. I just gave a program last night at the public library in Billings here on the wild horse herds. And a lot of the wild horses were captured and tamed and used. They're not pretty looking, but boy, they are tough. They were molded by the severe weather and the terrain of the West, from the deserts of southwestern Mexico all the way up into the rigors of Canada. So he, I think, deserves a lot of credit for showing the Western horse as it really was. And I think this is a perfect example. You wouldn't say those horses are beautiful, but you know they're going to get you through the winter storm and bring the food in. I like this picture. Kevin, do you remember if that's in the other room? It is? Okay. I think this is one of his finest. This is a double-page spread. Harper's is a magazine about 11 inches wide and about 16 inches tall, but sometimes they would have a double-page spread in the middle, and that's what some of his finest pictures were, and we've got some examples in the display. This is one of my favorite pictures. Would you agree that he is able to capture the horse in motion very effectively there? Don't you really sense that those horses are levitating themselves as they fly down the road? And we're going to get into the detail of that a little bit more here. Until the early 1880s, most artists depicted not only the running horse, but running wildlife in what I call the rocking horse pose. The front legs and the hind legs are out in front and behind respectively. And because that's what they thought the animal was doing, as showed here by Mr. Rindisbacher's picture of the Indian horse there. And here's another one by another artist showing this, again, what I call, you could also call it the hobby horse as well as the rocking horse pose. Another artist showing it, again, the legs out in the of the horse out in the front and the back simultaneously. Well, Leland Stanford, the man who created Stanford University, wanted to settle the controversy as to what the horse's legs looked like when they're in rapid gallop. So out on his farm, he set up a number of cameras with tripwires about every, 5 or 10 feet, with a tripwire hooked up to a camera that could have a very fast shutter speed. And as the horse ran by, it tripped all of these wires, and each individual picture then captured the horse in motion. And I want you to look at all of those, because I'm going to take specific pictures from these Muybridge photographs and show you that Remington incorporated those into his paintings. So here's a really good example. I tried to match these photographs by Muybridge as closely as I could to the paintings, and I think I did a fairly good job. And that's a really neat painting that's at the museum in New York. The buffalo. By the way, flintlock guns were relatively ineffective at buffalo hunting. An Indian could shoot about 6 arrows into 6 different buffalo in the time it took for a white man to shoot a flintlock and clean the barrel and reload it, get the powder in and fire it again. So the flintlock rifles weren't very effective, as this painting might begin to suggest. Here he's spinning the ball down the barrel of the gun, whereas the Indian is just pulling one arrow out of his quiver after another and killing multiple buffalo. Here's a painting from the Stampede by Lightning, and again notice the orientation of the hoofs. Another one. They're almost carbon copies, aren't they? Well, here is a man who hypothesized that Remington actually saw this before the Muybridge pictures became available to the public. However, modern scholars now believe that although Mr. Smith, who claimed that Remington saw the movement in the horse long before he ever heard of Muybridge or his discoveries, it's not believed to be the case, that that's not really true. That it's very likely that Remington was able to get a hold of some very early copies of Muybridge's photographs, and that's why so many of his horses are accurately depicted. A human being just cannot see the movement of those legs. It just wasn't possible. Remington, on the other hand, did not dispute this claim. He just thought, well, if this man wants to tell the world that I had phenomenal eyesight and intuition into what a horse was doing, I'll just let the world believe it. So anyway, here is, he's comparing himself. Oh, let's go back. This last paragraph is talking about Messier's painting of the horse's legs doubled up under like a crab. And he's comparing it to how imperfect the French artist was. By the way, as a little side story, I believe that French artist was the highest living artist in France at the highest paid living artist in France at the time. And Remington came close to that during his lifetime. So, Mr. Remington was trying to phase his art into the fine art world. So while he continued to submit a lot of articles and pictures to various magazines, he began to develop his fine art and tried to enter them into contests and into art galleries. And he did actually succeed in 1888, and he got a Harper's editor to give him a very fine credit there, as you can read at the bottom of the picture. This is another one of the more impressive double-page pictures that he painted. That was a big double-page spread in Harper's. Again, don't you get the sense that those horses are really in the air? He was a master at depicting the horse. So I think that it, just to repeat there, as it was said in his, about him, that he admired the strength and grace and speed and dignity of the Western horse. That's a quote from one of the articles he wrote. He wanted to be known as the foremost and best painter of the horse. And I think he earned that. Even right here, you get the sense of the cold that these horses had to withstand on the Western frontier. He was just a master at it. Now here's a sad commentary. Remington, as he became more and more acclaimed, paid higher and higher fees for his artwork, even during his illustration period before he merged into almost full-time fine art painting. He was fairly wealthy, and he could not control his desire for smoking and drinking and eating. He weighed almost 300 pounds, and it was very difficult for him to ride very effectively as he got older. And so even though he's noted for being a famous and notable and fine artist of the horse, it was harder and harder as he got older to actually ride them because he became too obese. Let's look at the woodblock engraving medium. Take a little digression here. You have to create a plate, and then each picture is made by one impression after another. So these are all have to be done by hand. And here's a list of what you have to do. You first of all need a fine piece of wood and to be able to engrave. Now they were engraving on steel and copper in the past, but during the middle of the 1800s, say from 1850 to about 1890, was the heyday of the woodblock, because you could take what was called boxwood and you would cut it across the trunk, say an inch thick or so. So you got like a round piece cut from a tree. So the end grain is going up and down like that. So you're carving on a surface that doesn't have a grain that goes left or right. It goes into the grain. So you can move your engraving tool in any direction you want, and you're not influenced by the grain that you see, on a long piece of wood cut parallel to the tree. And so they were able to take the original artwork and by a series of lines make these cuts in the wood. The part that was cut away would be the white in the picture, and the wood that was left behind, the highlight, would be inked, and that's what would be then pressed onto the paper. And so as I was mentioning before, by the time we're looking at Harper's, the Harper's company had their own engravers. So the artists were making the artwork, turning them over to their engravers. And so there was this person in between. And after 1870, photography came into its fore, and they were using photographs that would turn into woodblock engravings as well as, and then came along halftone, which are basically little dots and circles. So let's look at what the woodblock engraver would have to do. You would need a lot of light, because you're drawing very fine lines with very fine tools. And so so this is how you would have a globe of water and a lamp, and it would focus all the light right down onto the woodblock. So you could have an intense beam of light for drawing the lines into the wood. So here is this enlargement that I made is from the corner of this picture of Geronimo. See where it says Remington right there? This is an enlargement. An artist, an engraver, has to carve every one of those lines. So it took a long time. And he sometimes complained about how the engravers didn't faithfully execute his pictures onto the woodblock medium, but I think they did an excellent job. I don't go with Mr. Remington's complaint here that he's calling some of them clumsy blacksmith turned wood choppers who made my drawing say things I did not intend to say. I think he's being a little too harsh when you consider how tedious that work was and how fine they did it. When you go in that other room and look at those, I don't think you're going to find fault with any of the engravers. Some of the pictures were so large that they would have more than one block of wood to create the whole picture. And so they had to force them together. Like they would divide the picture maybe into 4 quarters, and each block of wood then did one quadrant, and then they'd have to force those blocks of wood together to make the final impression. You can see the lines in the actual picture of where the wood blocks were joined together because they accidentally or inadvertently left a gap in it. So there's another showing of the line that wound up being evidence that they engraved those on 2 blocks of wood and put them together. Well, as we saw by the 1890s, Remington and others' artwork was then being turned into what was called halftones. And they're basically, if you look at them with a microscope, they're little dots that have different diameters and different separations. And you can get, using these dots by their different diameters and separations, you can get a full gradation from the very slightest gray to the very almost charcoal brown color. And then along came color halftones, where instead of just black and white dots, like you see here, you could have dots of different color, and when they're superimposed on top of each other, they create the rainbow colors. And so it only took like 3 or 4 primary colors of dots to actually make a whole rainbow effect. And in our show, you'll see up on the wall there an example of how fine the tonality gradations are with the halftone process. Can you sense right there in that picture that's not a woodblock engraving? You know, if I go back to a woodblock engraving, there's a linearness to it, right? Because they're literally carving lines, whereas in the halftone process, everything is very, very smooth, like you can see in that picture that he did. By the way, this was a revolutionarist who was on the American side of the Rio Grande border, who went over the border to attack the powers that be in Mexico. He wanted to overthrow the powers in Mexico. He failed. This is another halftone, and this one's in the show to illustrate the difference between a woodblock engraving and the halftone. And can't you just see how, in a sense, that was a finer reproduction? It gave a little more smooth look to it. And so woodblock engraving pretty much died out in the 1890s as the halftone process came into the marketplace. And then especially with color halftone in the early 1900s, the monotone woodblock engraving was no longer used very much. And so in the new show that I'm working on, all of the pictures are color halftones that Collier's commissioned him to paint and reproduce in their magazines. So this is the other halftone picture that is in the exhibit. And here's an example then of the color halftone that is comprised of dots that the Collier's magazine really spread his renown. He was already very famous for his woodblock engravings in Harper's, but by the time Collier's got a hold of his paintings and did color halftones, his career really soared in the first decade of the 1900s. He died in late December of 1909 from a ruptured appendicitis, and that was the end of his career. So here's another example then of the color halftone. Let's look at his relationships to Native Americans. He had respect for them, just like he had respect for African Americans. He was around them a lot. He visited the reservations. But remember, he was basically an army man. He was a white man. He was part of the expansion of Euro-American culture across native lands. So it's not surprising that although he respected them and their fight to retain their homelands, he didn't quarrel with the idea that their homelands were going to shrink in the advance of white culture. He had a lot of respect for them. He's talking about the scout. Our average American Indians know everything that goes on for 40 miles on every side. He's talking about the scout. His life is on his sleeve. He hears a report, feels a shock, reels in his saddle, and he falls from his horse. In other words, the Indians knew the terrain so much better than the white interlopers. They had the advantage of understanding their homeland. They were brave fighters. They didn't mind trying to defend their homeland as best as they could. So he had a number of pictures that honored them for their efforts to resist white encroachment. He even went to the Blackfoot Reservation to make pictures of their Sundance, but he didn't arrive at the right time, so he actually bribed them to show them what it was like. I think that's offensive, in my own opinion, trying to get them to fake one of their religious ceremonies. Let's move on to Remington in Mexico. He spent a number of visits in the country, and he did a lot of drawings showing Mexican people in their activities, but his paintings, I think, are the best illustrations that show the color. Look at this fantastic color here, which he actually made into a woodblock engraving that I believe is in the show. And Here are some other paintings that he did. I think red was one of his, red and yellow were some of his more favorite colors that he found in Mexico. He admired the Mexican army, and because after all, he felt very ingrained within the American army. He respected the Mexican army, and he did a number of paintings showing the Mexican army out in the field. A color painting. And again, here's another picture of him trying to show this military action on the Rio Grande River. Remember, I mentioned that it did fail. So he became very friendly with General Nelson Miles, and General Nelson Miles also became friendly with Remington because they realized it was symbiotic, that if you have a good artist that can show what the American Army is doing, the officers are going to like that. So, and then being friends with the officers gave him permission to be in the field with them. So Remington had no trouble going to about any Army post and feeling welcome and being provided with an escort, maybe with a horse, provisions. So he in turn then did a lot of pictures that showed the Army in its field operations. And here's one actually showing General Nelson Miles. You can imagine he liked having his picture showing in Harper's. You know, Harper's Weekly was the most important medium of news in the country for almost 50 years, from the Civil War era to the end of the 1800s. I often say that Harper's Weekly was the combination of radio and television and the internet that we have today for accessing information. It was the source of news that most people paid attention to in the United States, along with Leslie's Illustrated, which was a companion competitor, but it didn't have the circulation that Harper's did. And Remington was actually not too far from the Wounded Knee Massacre, but of course he felt sympathy with the Army because that's the side he was on, and he actually depicted himself in this scene right here as the artist, and there's General Miles. You know, this was a very sad event that I don't need to go into much detail about, but it was started by the white fears of the ghost dance that alarmed the whites to a very high degree, and there was a very unfortunate clash between whites and Indians, and I believe they estimate 250 or more men, women, and children, Native Americans, were killed in that exchange. And I bet you probably didn't know that I think about 20 or more medals of honor were given to the white soldiers in that engagement, and I think Native people would like to see that rescinded. I think I've read that. So it has not happened. But that was the closest that Remington came to an actual battle. They were not too far from the encampment before the fighting started, and a band of Indians told them to turn around, and they did. Charles Shrivogel was another artist who Remington felt was trying to usurp his position as the artist of the American soldier and cavalryman. He gained renown for pictures like this one right here that won some exhibit awards. But Mr. Shrivogel did not have the experience in the field that Remington did. And he got really, really over-critical of that other artist. And Remington wound up not looking too great at the criticism he was leveling at a fellow artist who was doing a pretty good job at the same thing he was. Let's look at the use of photography. There's actually a book on the subject. He did use the camera. He often talked about his Kodak. Instantaneous photography was what he called it. He says, I could write a large library on it. He used it a lot. not for final compositions, but for detail work, and I'll show you some examples. He would take a picture to get an idea of the scene, and he would write notes about the photograph, like the colors that he would use. So he would make sketches, he would photograph the scene to get some of the fine detail. He also had a lot of artifacts that he would gather. He would ask his Army officer friends to send him photographs from the field because he wanted to have his paintings accurate with the artifacts that were in it. He wanted the uniforms to look right, the saddles, the accoutrements, the native materials looking right. So he was always on the lookout for any medium that would help him depict the Western scene accurately. And so you notice I found some quotations here. I photographed to my heart's content the Indians. They didn't seem to notice. Ran along and shot 12 plates of the doughboys. I can beat a Kodak. Kodaks have no brains. The artist must know more than the Kodak, which he misspelled there. It ends in a K. I got lots of ideas, but no sketches as my camera was not loaded. So let's look at some examples. So here was a photograph that was in his library, and it probably gave him the backgrounds for some of the buildings there. Here is actually an L.A. Huffman photograph that he pretty much took about 90% of the imagery and just made his own artwork from it. So he wasn't ashamed of using photography as a means to increase his accuracy. But photography was a very difficult medium then in the 1880s and 90s. A lot of the film was slow. That is, you couldn't capture motion very well, although we know Muybridge did manage to do some high-speed photography. But in general, most photography, it wasn't very sophisticated. It didn't have very fast film. And the photographs just didn't, a photograph itself was difficult to compete with an artwork. Now, there are some photographers that I could give you lectures on that I could disagree with, whose photographs from that time period were absolute beautiful works of art, but I won't go into that. But the average photograph was not what you would consider fine art. So you can see this is probably the height of his illustration career in 1888. Look at all of the things that appeared in these magazines. And at the same time, though, he wanted to move away from just illustration into fine art. So he's exhibiting pictures at the Academy of Design and hoping to win some awards. And let's look into some of those. Turnabout is fair play. I think this is one of the pictures that he entered. And his pictures were also reproduced in many of the fine books of the time period. Take a look at these three major works that his artwork was used as fine illustrations, including the Oregon Trail by Francis Parkman. Those are some of the outstanding books of the time period that were very widely disseminated, and he was able to be the artist for those editions. This painting actually won an award in the Paris International Exhibition, and just in 1999 it sold for $4.3 million. So that gives you an idea of how his paintings that he was trying to do in addition to his illustration work were beginning to make an impression on the art world. And here is the engraving that was based upon that previous exhibit or painting, and I'm putting them here together. You notice the composition changed a little bit by the engraver to make the central figure, turned him around. You notice this man is looking to the right, here he turned him and looked this way. That's about the only change that he did, but I would almost say he made it into a little better of a picture. By comparison, here's this grand painting, which is now at the Buffalo Bill Center for the West in Cody. It's a huge grand painting. Perhaps some of you have seen it in Cody. It was actually rejected by the French committee. as being, quote, too German. and it's almost unfair because you know what it's implying? It's implying that the Indians, if you look at the subject and the title, The Last of the Buffalo, it's implying the Indians did the buffalo in. That is a falsehood. We know that Native people thrived for 10,000 years on the American West high plains with buffalo. When the white man got to the West, there were 40 to 50 million buffalo. So the idea that the Native Americans were responsible for the last of the buffalo is totally false. The white hide hunters came west in the 1870s and 80s and literally wiped them out by hundreds of buffalo at a time. But it's just an unfortunate name for that grand painting because it implies that the Indians were responsible for the killing off the buffalo, and that's just simply not the very important part of the story. So he did achieve by the end of his illustration period, started beginning to win some really grand awards. This painting is at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. It was one of their most famous and most proudly exhibited paintings. It's not hanging in the foyer now like it used to when I was there 15 or 20 years ago, but it is a huge grand painting. Look at the dimensions, 48 by 84 inches. And it's been reproduced endlessly. I've actually framed reproductions for people. So as I was saying, not only did he use photographs to make his artwork accurate, he also got a lot of artifacts. And so his studio was all full of materials, and that was reproduced at the Buffalo Bill Center for the West. So you can see kind of what his studio actually looked like. Well, here's what Remington, he was actually dead when this was written because he died in late December of 1909. But I like this quote, "But then came a change. He left far behind him the brittleness of the pen and drawings," which I don't think is fair, "which he once scattered so profusely through magazines and books. His reds and yellows, which had blared so too mercilessly from his canvases, began to take on more of the aspect of nature. Incidentally, the mark of the illustrator disappeared and that of the painter took place." So he had the pleasure of achieving a lot of critical acclaim in the last 10 years of his life when he left illustration behind and concentrated on fine art painting. And so he did get some acclaim before he died prematurely. He asked many people that if his gravestone would say he knew the horse, his wife refused. It just has his name and his dates. That's the end of the program, and I'd be glad to take questions.
You didn't talk about the relationship. It seems to me that there was a real relationship between Remington and Charlie Russell. Got here about the same time. Seeing buffalo skulls and Remington's pictures. The difficult alliance between the white man and the Indian, doubtful handshake, but I mean the same themes.
Right.
Same scenes.
There has been a lot of scholarship about the relationship between the two. They did not have a personal relationship that we're aware of. They obviously knew of each other. Remington's artwork came on the scene before Russell's did. And so it's very clear that Russell saw a lot of these early engravings that you're looking at here and in this slideshow and in the exhibit. And so he probably learned some of artistic techniques, because we know that Russell's artwork, say prior to 1900, was fairly amateurish. Russell's wife talked him into going to New York City to visit the galleries and get his work in a wider circle besides the guys at the bar at the Mint in Great Falls. And he began meeting other artists in the illustration field and the fine art field in New York and other places. So his art began to take a very more polished turn after 1900. I think between, say, 1900 to 1915, Russell's work was at its apogee. Whereas Remington preceded him, and I don't think, I haven't read any criticism of one of those artists criticizing the other. They had to have been very aware of each other, and I think they were just appreciating the fact that the wider audience wanted to see more of the art that both of them were creating. And they were very different in their outlook, especially toward Native Americans. Charlie Russell had a deep empathy for Native people. For example, every picture that he did of Lewis and Clark was from the Indians' point of view discovering Lewis and Clark rather than Lewis and Clark discovering the Indians. Russell dressed up as an Indian. There's photographs of him with Indian friends, and he's dressed up in Indian regalia. Remington would never did that and would never think of it. So there's a lot of difference in their philosophy and in their approach to their art, but I'm not aware that they ever clashed or that the critics were like condemning one versus the other. So, did they ever what? I have not read that they've ever met each other. I've done a lot of reading of Russell and Remington, and I don't recall any physical meeting where they were in the same room. More questions? Well, thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy not only the Remington shows, but what I've labored to produce on private land mostly. Those are pictures that came from people who allowed me on their property. There are a few from public lands, but it's been a lot of fun, and I'm still continuing to photograph homestead material out there. So thank you for coming to this program.